Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger at bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, welcome your host, Jessica, with this podcast episode of Workology.
According to the Brennan Center for Justice, nearly 1/3 of the adult population has a criminal record. In this hot job market for qualified talent, we could be limiting our talent pool simply because someone might have a criminal record. Is that a good idea in this market? This decision could be impacting your business in ways you really can't imagine, because you're closing yourself off from a qualified and engaged workforce. Today I'm joined with Stephanie Hammerwold. She's the co-founder of the Pacific Reentry Career Services. Her nonprofit supports women in finding meaningful employment who have had a criminal conviction. She also works to educate employers on the benefits of hiring this population. Stephanie, welcome to the Workology podcast.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the backstory and your journey to get here to where you're launching the Pacific Reentry Career Services.
Well, I started back in about 2003 in HR, and it kind of, I've told my story many times before that it was basically just a temp job and ended up sticking as a career. And that was following getting my master's degree in women's studies and also working in a domestic violence shelter while I was doing that down in San Diego. And so I have a strong background in nonprofits, so it's kind of a weird transition to get into that corporate environment, but I found HR and it kind of stuck. While I was starting my career in HR, I was also volunteering to do a weekly art and writing workshop in the local jail with women there. And it was really eye-opening for me because people would ask me that question, so where do you work? What do you do when you're not here doing these workshops with us? And I said, well, I'm starting this career in HR. And I'd inevitably get peppered with questions, about what do I do when I get out? I can't ever find a job. Nobody wants to hire me because of my record. And it got me to thinking about those issues. So always within my own hiring, and I ended up doing a lot of hiring in the course of my HR career, I was always thinking about how can we look beyond that? And I was hiring for a lot of entry-level jobs that were actually really good positions for people to get into when they got out of jail or prison, because they were often stepping stones into better careers. So really with what we're doing, we don't just want people to find a job. We want to mentor people into how do you turn this into a career? How do you, get hired as a cashier at CVS and figure out how down the road you're going to move into management or into an office job. And so I've been doing HR consulting for the last couple of years, and my business partner and I started thinking, we really wanted to do something different. And we'd thrown out the idea of a nonprofit for a while and trying to figure out how we wanted to use our skills. And we just kind of threw all that out on the table in the fall and realized, we were onto something with kind of taking our experience in the HR field and putting it into helping the reentry population. And I kind of joke, it's using my skills of HR for good rather than evil.
I'm just thinking about how thankful these individuals that you work with are, because you are helping them be able to get their foot in the door someplace and really change their life.
Yeah, and I think that a job is really a stepping stone to turning your life around, because having that stable paycheck, will help secure housing. And that's something that will ultimately help reunite families. And most of the women we're working with, a lot of them have children, that were being raised by somebody else while they were serving sentences. And a lot of times there's conditions to getting your kids back. And one of those things is having that job, having that place to live, being able to pay rent, being able to buy groceries, all those things we kind of can take for granted sometimes.
In your work, what have you found? Are the general population, are there stereotypes? I mean, I know that there are, but what are you finding from those stereotypes around people who have criminal convictions? Do you have any research?
Yeah, well, and the biggest question I always get from employers or hiring managers is it safe to hire this population? I'll say, a large number of people that are locked up for drug-related offenses and other nonviolent offenses. And most of them just need that second chance. And in fact, there was a recent study that came out of Harvard and the University of Massachusetts, and they looked at what happened when the military allowed those with felony records to enlist. And they found not only that did those folks do just as well as those without a record, but they were often quicker to be promoted within the military. And obviously, as the study points out, they were also looking at other factors when deciding whether or not to allow someone to enlist, to make sure they'd be a good fit for the military. But I think it's a really good lesson for non-military employers to look at in terms of how we use criminal convictions in the hiring process and looking beyond that to the whole candidate rather than just that one little checkbox.
I feel like the background check industry is so huge, and it's kind of a standard. Like, you put somebody through the background check and drug testing process. How do we work to educate the workplace, so our practitioners and hiring managers, but also change those stereotypes?
I think it's a lot of just getting out there, talking, networking with people, and really working to dispel those myths. And I come at this, from an HR background as somebody who has hired folks with records before. As somebody who's had quite a bit of success hiring folks from the reentry population. And I found that most of them, aren't getting, wanting a job to go out there and steal and, commit other violations in their employer. They want to keep that job. In fact, some of the worst terminations I've done in my HR career are people whose applications were squeaky clean, who got in there and started shoplifting or engaging in other bad behavior. And I've kind of started to see just in my own experience that criminal record didn't necessarily tie into those kinds of, later employee problems that can crop up. But I think it's really just getting out there, talking to people, educating them, just saying, look, from my experience, this is what's happened. And getting other HR people on board with that and helping them, to spread the word as well.
Well, let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today, we're talking with Stephanie Hammerwold about why you should consider candidates with a criminal past. You can follow Stephanie on Twitter at HRHammer. All right, let's talk a little bit about ban the box. Does this ban the box help or hurt your efforts here?
I think it's a really good place to start the discussion about how we use criminal records in the hiring process. And like I said, in my own experience, I found that it's not always the automatic red flag that we tend to think of it being in the hiring process. We kind of, I think, when you're screening tons and tons of applications, you have this list in your mind. These are the things that automatically toss someone in the reject pile. And I think too often we put that criminal conviction thing on there, and it biases us. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, we see that about someone, and you have that little, nagging sense in your mind, like, maybe I shouldn't trust this person because they've served time in jail or prison. So that's what I like about the ban the box process, or the movement. And that's not to say that there's some jobs I think a criminal background check is important. There's certain things like working with children. You don't want to hire people that have had certain kinds of convictions, or working with other sensitive populations. You might think, okay, there's a certain list of convictions that I don't want, in employees. But, a lot of the hiring I did was for cashiers and warehouse workers. And in my mind, I'd be hard pressed to find a reason to automatically exclude someone just because they had a criminal background from those jobs. And so I think we need to kind of, as HR professionals, look at each job and determine if criminal background is relevant to that position. I think that's kind of what I like about the ban the box initiatives, is it gets you to think, okay, do I really need to be asking this question up front? And it helps remove that bias from the process.
It's kind of been interesting as I think back on my human resources career in situations where we had somebody where we've done the background check and something has come up, and the person has even provided previous employers of mine with documentation to say, hey, this was dismissed, it's still on my record, and we decided to not hire them. I think that most of us think about those kind of scenarios and situations, and we might need to maybe have a conversation with our CEO or senior leaders and kind of work to change some assumptions or maybe their ways of thinking just a little bit.
Yeah, and for sure. And like I said, taking each job on its own to see when it's relevant. Somebody handling a lot of sensitive financial information, you probably don't want to hire somebody who has embezzlement in their past, but somebody who has a minor drug offense could probably do perfectly well in that job.
I just think in my background, we've had situations where we had people who had like a series of bound checks or something like that, and we wouldn't hire them as a cashier. But I can think, the economy and what happened with the recession, I think probably most of us have maybe experienced some sort of mark or challenge and conviction, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony.
Right, and you don't want that to follow you around years and years later. and keep you from moving forward and moving beyond that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the EEOC, and they made some suggestions, but let's talk about the ramifications from the EEOC of a company who might choose not to consider candidates with criminal histories.
Back in 2012, the EEOC issued their guidance saying that the use of criminal histories in the hiring process, that employers should be really careful with that because of possible disparate impact claims. They were looking at statistics and saw that certain racial groups were much more likely to have convictions in their past than other racial groups, and that this could, unnecessarily affect the hiring process. And so their recommendation was that employers really look at whether or not looking at a criminal history, they must show that excluding somebody because of a criminal history is job-related and consistent with business necessity. And there's been some challenges to this in the last couple of years. There was a case in 2015 where the decision came in favor of the employer's use of criminal background checks. And it's not law, it's guidance at this point, but it's really important. I think it's a good place for employers to start who want to evaluate how they use criminal backgrounds in the hiring process. And going back to what I said, taking each job and saying, is it really necessary to ask this question? And figuring out and focusing only on those jobs where a criminal history might affect somebody's performance. And so that's kind of what I point people towards with that EEOC guidance. I'm like, read through it, figure out how that might apply to your situation and your jobs, and be kind of proactive as the system kind of works out how this guidance is going to become more and more important in the upcoming years.
And we'll link to the EEOC guidance in the transcript of the podcast over on Blogging for Jobs as well. Can you talk to us about some of the economic benefits for hiring employees with a criminal past?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, or WOTC, as it's abbreviated. And this provides a tax incentive to employers who hire those from certain targeted groups, which includes those with criminal histories. It also includes the disabled, food stamp recipients, people who've been on unemployment for a long time. That one was recently added in, and other different groups that are typically considered the harder to employ folks out there. So, it's an excellent incentive. What I always do with people, too, is I refer them to their state agency that handles WOTC applications. For us here in California, that's the Employment Development Department. And I've talked to the person here in Orange County where I live at the employment office who actually helps employers with that. And that's kind of your best resource for that. And if you go on to the Department of Labor's website for WOTC, you can find a link to all the different state agencies and connect with your local person to get more information. Often, if you have an accountant, they can help you get some information as well. But just do a little reading up on it, do a little research. It can be a little scary, I think, to apply for tax credits, just because sometimes you have to jump through hoops and things. But really, there are a lot of resources out there to help employers apply for that. There's also the federal bonding program, which is at bondsforjobs.com, bonds number 4. jobs.com. And that covers the first 6 months of employment for people that are considered at risk. It's free to employees and employers. And it's a good way, if you're a little concerned about protecting yourself, it's a good way to do that. And then there's like the National Hire Network. And they also have lists, of different state programs that might be available for hiring people in this group as well. And I think there's just the individual, the kind of more personal economic benefit as well when we're talking about individuals getting jobs and getting back to work, and that's going to reduce their risk of going back to jail or prison. And as we know, it's expensive to keep somebody locked up in jail or prison. It's much better if they're out in society, being productive, paying taxes, just contributing in general. It takes away, from a lot of that money that goes towards those resources that are used to imprison people. Agreed.
Well, for those who are listening that might either have a criminal record themselves or maybe they have a family member who is struggling to find work, what advice can you give them?
Really, it's getting connected with a lot of the services out there. And it's, I think it's scary for a lot of people when they first get out because basically they'll, often be handed a list like, here's some places you can call if you want. And it's on them to follow up. And it's on them to kind of work on building that support network. And depending on what their family situation is, their community situation, they might be getting out and not have a place to live. It might be going into a homeless shelter or a halfway house, and then so finding housing, getting signed up for insurance, figuring out if they can register to vote. All those things are kind of scary. So I think really taking the time to reach out to people in the community. I've gotten involved with the Orange County Reentry Partnership here in Southern California, which is a network of service providers that help from everything from housing to drug rehab to employment to childcare issues, and getting connected with those service providers. Because often, if you have a problem, like with us, we just focus on employment. But if somebody comes to us and says, I'm also having trouble with housing, we have several different people we can refer them to. And that's going to help build that support network. And that's what I really see our role as. We want to be mentors. We want to kind of customize a job search program and be that friend, that supporter who practices for interviews, who, when somebody has an interview and it doesn't go well, who's there to say, hey, it's okay, you're going to do better next time. I think that's really important. And, we list job search tips and all kinds of information up on our website. We'll be putting a lot more up there in the coming months. So that's a good place to start. Another organization I really like here in California is Root and Rebound. They put together this huge guide, roadmap to reentry, that has sections on housing, on rehab, on mental health services, all these things. And they provide that guide for free to people that are currently incarcerated or who have recently been released. And so I know other states have similar programs as well. So it's just, I think if you connect with one person that's in the reentry service provider community, it can open up, a lot of options just to have that support network.
So let's say that somebody is interested in maybe getting started in their own community. Should they reach out to you and maybe get some more insights of the starting point? Or what do you suggest?
Yeah, and I'd love to connect with people. We've just kind of gone through the whole process of applying for our nonprofit status and got that back in May, which is kind of an extensive process. We had an attorney help us with that. But I've also been connecting with other people that are trying to start their own organizations. And so that's been valuable for us as well as for them, because we kind of share our, ups and downs and, what's working, what's not working. And it's just good to connect with other people doing that same kind of work. And I met people get into this kind of work with the reentry population for a couple different reasons. Sometimes they have their own interaction with the criminal justice system, or they've worked on the social services side, or like, us, we come just from being business professionals who care a lot about giving people second chances.
Well, Stephanie, thank you for joining us today. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
So our website is prcsca.org, and that has all kinds of information about what we do. We're going to be putting up some features on other service providers in the area. We also list events that are happening in our area. People can find out about volunteering, donating, or even getting involved as a client if you know somebody in the Southern California area who needs job search help in their first couple years after release. We'd be happy to work directly with them. Even if it's something we can't do, we'll refer people to other places. We don't want to just turn folks away, but we will try and point them towards somebody who can help them. And then our website obviously also has links to our social media profiles on Facebook and Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the listener for joining the Workology podcast today, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our previous Workology podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.